目的はわかりませんが、大悟さんが撃たれたことに関係している連中かもしれません。
Either or is fine.
どこかの国がいろんな
I
手
don't
使って
particularly.
大悟さんの居場所を
I
知ろうとしてるんでしょう。
difficulty presets.
大悟の安否を確かめるため
Personally. But either having both is the ideal
もし大悟さんが亡くなっているとしたら、
rather than just having a choice.
これ以上嬉しいニュースはありま
But
せん。
I like
どちらにせよ
presets
桐生さんの味方じゃないことだけは確かです。
because I want to play what the developer intended.
わかった。
I'm not interested in my own experience, my own tailored experience. With that said, though, it's kind of weird about difficulty presets. If you're an old school gamer, it has always been that, where you choose your presets, right? And the developer already implied which preset is the intended, all of them. So you choose which intended preset you want from the developer. But then it kind of went backwards and went, hey, we want to do dynamic difficulties, right? And then people pushed back for choice. Then the choice was allowed to be, now choice is the gold standard again, but the choice is now tailored to the gamer's perspective, like for accessibility. And now the next phase, I think that would be the gold standard, is to offer both, which is the accessibility and indication of which one is the developer's dynamic intended difficulty. Or offer even more than that, a gold standard where it uses dynamic difficulty, a preset, and indicate which one is the developer's intended, and the accessibility options. So they could do all of them. It is possible, and it has been most of the major developers have done 3 of the 5 that I mentioned, and they typically just carry it over with that design in mind. So for example, it's not, yeah, it's the same. Yeah, adaptive would be the word, but I wouldn't call it adaptive because it doesn't make the game easier or harder based on what type of player you're going to get. It's based on their performance. So the player can perform poorly or better randomly, right? So it's just a difficulty that dynamically changes. It's not adapting to like, I don't like the word adapted because it would suggest that if a player is really, really good, it would get harder and harder until the player can't succeed, which is not true. That's not how, like, the game isn't adapting to you. It's just changing the difficulty dynamically to offer a different experience. The game could actually get easier when the difficulty sways and stuff, like, because players can do certain things better than other things. So dynamic difficulties as opposed to be adaptive. It's not guaranteed that adaptive would imply something like an exam or something where they're measuring something and they can increase the difficulty until you can't do it anymore because they're measuring that one thing. But it's very difficult to make something like that adaptive to in a video game, unless you're playing maybe something like Osu or puzzle game. I would say puzzle games could be considered adaptive difficulty. If a puzzle game has few rules and they adapt those rules to the player's proficiency, I would consider that as, yeah. So like if the puzzle game only offers like 4 different options of motion, and they adaptively make those 4 options more and more complicated as the player gets better. That's fair enough. Dynamic would suggest anything goes. So, for example, the example I was going to use was the combination of accessibility and choice would be the recent God of War games. The God of War 2 by Santa Monica Studio. They offer choice in the presets. There's no dynamics, but in the presets, they tell you and describe what the preset difficulties do. That could be great, but honestly, I would love to see a more dynamic thing where if you a good example of a dynamic set would be something like Shadow of Mordor, like the Shadow of Mordor games, where if you're performing poorly, you possibly can get punished as part of the game, right? Or you're performing really strong or you do something really effectively, the game responds by reactively doing something else that isn't what you're already doing constantly. So the game isn't necessarily adaptively trying to meta you, but it can. But it's just changing it so that you have to change up your style or your thing. But it doesn't make it any more difficult or any... It doesn't guarantee that it makes it more difficult. It's just different. They try to do something different. There are games like... there are games that deliberately meta you by design or by preset. So pretty much all of those. I would say all of the above. If it's possible. But you need a game that is large, not too large that you can do all that stuff. And the game has to be modular enough to accommodate all those things, which that's asking for a lot. That's asking for a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of foresight. And I think the reason why I think it's possible is because indie games do that. But indie games make small games. They make the largest game they can, but offer the most dynamics in difficulty. So, for example, like a different mode is a different type of difficulty. It's not adaptive, as in going from easy, normal, hard, and you just scale up the stats. That would still be considered adaptive difficulty. A dynamic difficulty would be when you go from normal to hard, something just completely different changed about the features. So you play the game differently, and that's the only difference. Like, it could end up being easier or harder. It's not to scale up. So it's a mix of both. And I hope that's the future of gaming, in my opinion, for difficulty settings. In this game, it is not. It is a scale up. It's a preset scale up. And they scale up really hard. Like, really, really hard. Actually, oh, which way I'm supposed to go? I think I'm supposed to go down here. Anyways, yeah. Nothing fundamentally changed. So this is the classical, old school, the old school scale up, preset scale ups. So your experience, the one major factor that changes with the preset is how long you're doing something. So it challenges your consistency game. It does not do anything else. So it does not dynamically do anything else. It tries to mirror an adaptive difficulty game where it's just adapting to force you into a more consistency, to force more consistency out of you, as opposed to being more dynamic with your solutions. They're both about the same, though. You could make an argument that that is adapting to the situation, and that can be fair. I just don't think that when difficulty changes, it doesn't have to be more difficult. It can end up being easier but different. Where do I... thought I'm supposed to go up Pink Street. What the heck? Oh, wait. Hold up. This is where I encounter the secret agents. I encounter the secret agents in this lot right here. The CIA agents. Not Richardson yet, but the CIA agents right here. You ready for some English, Japanese? I mean, yeah. The CIA agents. The words I'm using are merely semantics. I know you and I probably are saying the same thing though. Like, with all that said, the only reason I shared that was those words may mean slightly different, but they are more or less the same. I imagine when you heard me say dynamic, you probably were thinking the same thing. Or maybe the only thing that I was sharing that you might not have considered is that when a game's mechanic changes, it doesn't necessarily have to be harder. It just has to change. And that in itself can feel difficult for people. But for me, I want it to be dynamic. Like, if I had a preference, I prefer a dynamic preset. So the developers designed the game to be played multiple different ways without a choice. So no hard, normal, legend. Just if I play a game and I'm doing really well in it, suddenly my entire experience is different. And then if I'm playing it again and I'm like mediocre, my entire experience is different. This is what characterizes the roguelike experience. But the roguelike experience is not big enough to accommodate dramatic experience differences. There hasn't been a roguelike game with a budget at a scale that makes the entire game experience dramatically different. So what they typically do on a smaller scale for smaller games is to just create different modes. And those modes are considered an imitation, in my opinion, of what a dynamic difficulty would be like. And even in the bigger games, they compartmentalize by introducing RNG, right? RNG mechanics like boon selection, power selection, things like that, that will continue to make it feel dynamic. You're constantly dynamically changing based on the choices you make. The game can be brutally easier, brutally harder. It could have no change, but ultimately it is dynamic in its difficulty, but the player themselves is being adaptive to the dynamic difficulty, is why I would use those words. An adaptive difficulty is weird because it would suggest whatever your choice is, the game will adapt to it, which it in the way it's done now, it really doesn't. The game, it would be cool to see what happens in that way, where like if you picked a range character, right? Like if you somehow made a range character, then the game will say, we're going to give you a non-range boss, a melee boss, because you decided to pick range. I don't know if anybody has done that, but that type of game design could be very off-putting too. As in, the game is programmed to beat you, as opposed to the game offers you obstacles and you find different solutions to this, like a mix of obstacles, that kind of thing. So I wouldn't mind trying a game like that. Inevitably you will lose, but maybe there's a way that the way you lose feels rewarding enough for people. For me, I don't mind if I lose. You learn something from loss, all the time. So if there's a game that's unwinnable, I'd probably be really interested in seeing and playing a game that's unwinnable. That would be an adaptive game. So like a chess, for example, like an AI machine learning chess game where you're going to play, eventually you beat them, but eventually they learn to beat you with nearly 99 to 100% accuracy, right? They're going to keep training, far exceeding you. That would be something that would be adaptive. Which it takes a person with a lot of self-esteem to to want to play a game like that, I think. Which I wouldn't mind. A game or two. Not all games, obviously. Like, that would be too much. Stealing game ideas. One example of adaptive difficulty that I can say in real life, like the closest thing I can think of, is peer review. Peer review, it's not like happening dynamically with one-to-one person, but peer review is the closest thing that I can think of where you practice a skill, have a lot of wisdom, knowledge, and experience, and you are constantly fighting an uphill battle. That the closest thing I can think of is peer review. So like when you're doing a scientific research, right? Like you're trying to publish a paper, no matter what, you are trying to do just good enough where the bigger group, the group that is always at an advantage, will accept you for doing sufficient, but you're never going to exceed the bigger group. It's kind of like another example of adaptive difficulty would be one person trying to beat an entire company of people. Over time, the company will exceed you because you are one person. They will adaptively exceed you because there are more people, right? Like it's a higher threshold. So you are inevitably going to lose. And that would be so fun to see if someone could make that process into a game that people find rewarding. I could think of it, the closest thing I can think of is there was a series made by Criterion Game, is a driving series called Burnout. Back in the PlayStation days, it's not a very popular genre anymore. It's more like vehicular driving that is reckless vehicular driving, or like Twisted Metal kind of thing, where like vehicular destruction or destruction derby, where being a goofball and wrecking yourself early to lose can feel great if you lost gloriously. Yeah, so like that stuff, it's like, oh yeah, I want to win the race, but if I crash really, really bad, I'll just go back and play it again. But the idea is it's making it so that losing against more and more odds and going out in a blaze of glory is kind of nice. It's intuitively nice. So if they could adapt that to an AI that shows that what's a game like that? There were some games back in the day. Arcade games were designed that way in a way. So back in the days, the arcade cabinets, right? We didn't have machine learning, AI, or the compute power to do that. But what they were trying to do to preset it is to do that. Basically, they keep driving the difficulty over time until the person loses, and that's it. Like just the odds. Well, eventually you'll end up in a blaze of glory, and the run is the blaze of glory. And now just imagine that with modern technology. Basically, technology that has someone stacking and machine learning and countering you again and again, that'd be great. In my opinion, in a way that develops life skills, like peer review. A scientist becomes better and more experienced at understanding the shortcomings and the strengths of their research and their career because they are constantly racing against their peers who are constantly in competition and scrutinizing your work. So they are adaptively challenging you endlessly. So if you can design a game in which you can adaptively mature a system that also dynamically changes over time, you could have a game that effectively constantly require no outside resource to benefit someone. So that's kind of like the idea of a chess player playing against a deep learning AI. At some point, you'll learn more over time, and it's dynamically changing because it's adaptively reading the player. Are we there yet? There are some in the future. It's not too far in the future. The next couple games, there are some coming in 2024 that developers are claiming they're using deep learning for their AI models to provide some like solo campaign challenges, like FPSs, like how AI movement works. They're trying to apply new computational methods to provide an adaptive opponent, like an adaptive, like what happens if you shoot off the entire left flank? Well, then the AI would know that all the NPCs that they have control, they could, cover certain flanks. So they would like dynamically change over time, but adaptive to the player. Right now, the only thing that's happening is usually dynamic difficulty changes. Basically, you're comfortable with these set of rules now. Let's add another rule on top of that. And those rules can be completely unrelated to each other. So they're not really adapting. They're just changing the name of the game. So like God of War 2, what they did was regular enemies have other modifiers. So you have to get used to the idea that it happens on regular enemies now. They changed the rules of the game as opposed to assuming what the player would be able to do. But in actuality, the developers try to figure out what the guys are trying to do, like what the players like you are trying to do. This game is way before that. PlayStation 3 was not the era of, and I still feel like back in the PlayStation 3 era, it's about substance, like the content, the preset content. So it's less concerning regarding the player's aptitude. And for me, I'm okay with that. Like, give me all of that. The gaming industry in general is my dynamic difficulty, not a singular game. The gaming industry as a whole, creative arts as a whole, is my dynamic difficulty. That's probably, we'll leave it there. Wait, that is Richardson. Never mind. No, Richardson is here. He's in the middle. He has the red tie. I thought it was like some other guy, but we kick Richardson's butt, so it's fine. I think we can shoot the other guys, right? Yeah, so he always does that kick that auto stuns you. Yeah, we can. Yeah, see, that's what I mean. He keeps going, hey, and that's when I learned to tiger drop that thing because it's so aggressively annoying. But we have to take out his other guys first. All right. Stop EIing, please. Yeah, he auto combos. Yeah, EI that. Get up. Get up. EI that. Get up. Get up, Richardson. Yeah. See, this is where I could link it back to my digression about dynamic difficulty. Or adaptive. If it's adaptive, basically now the boss would start to never do anything that's susceptible to the tiger drop. So they would just say like, oh, don't do that again. That's the third time. It obviously doesn't work, right? A dynamic difficulty would be when the boss changes to phase 2, the pattern changes. That would be an example of dynamic difficulty. So most of the time, the game is using an approach to approximate a dynamic difficulty, where the boss just changes it up. Like, things just change, regardless of what the player is doing. You know, like from soft games, when the boss goes into phase 2, they just get new things. That is irregardless of the player's aptitude, other than they succeeded. Oh, I missed. So yeah, like the boss would stop doing this, basically. Which is not the case, obviously. But you have to do this so many more times because of the preset. And obviously you can mess up. And one of the things about estimation of dynamic difficulty is when you add it to a pool of RNG stuff, like, so let's just say you add happenstance, right? So the boss will randomly do things. That is also dynamic. It is not adaptive. It is just adding more things to the pool, and regardless of what the player does, the player has to respond to it. It's not responding to anything the player is actually doing. But it's all semantics. The player is adapting. So if it's the difficulty, if you're looking at the perspective, you could call it adaptive difficulty if it's what the player's doing. I typically refer to the game from the dev's perspective, because the game is designed from the dev's perspective. These older games are. And that's where I brought in accessibility. Accessibility has players in mind a lot of times. I enjoy games personally with not me in mind, more like what they envision in mind. I like when developers design games because they want to, as opposed to, hey, we need to make this game a certain way because it will reach out to most of the players. I am not that type of player. However, I don't mind at all that that's how developers make a lot of money. That's how developers become popular enough to do what they want to do, and so on. So I acknowledge that developers have to do that, like the bigger developers, in order to have a chance to make a game that caters to me, which is having an experience that isn't about my convenience and isn't about my choice. It's more about telling me what they want. If they want a game that is borked beyond belief and infuriates their player, I want to experience that because that's what the developer wants me to experience. I want to experience something that I don't have control over. I prefer that because my experiences are my experiences. They're not as interesting. I can't remember any example of actually adaptive difficulty apart from MGSV. True. Metal Gear Solid would be, especially 5, would be it would be a close example. Like, it has bits of it. The closest examples I have are where developers, like an indie game developer, like a small game, where like puzzle games are a great example. When you reduce it to something very simple. So for example, the first set of puzzles make you think a certain way, right? Like, you got to push all these things. You got to push all these things. And then suddenly, in the next world or level, you can't push anymore. You have to think of pulling everything. And that's technically an example of adaptive difficulty, but it's a preset adaptive difficulty, as in the developers meted you, but the thing is, it's not adapted to everyone else. Like, it's not guaranteed to always be adaptive depending on the player, right? But it's an example of trying to make your game meta the player because you designed the game to make the player do something psychologically that is different. But then you intentionally make them do the opposite or make them do something else. Like my nightmarish example of these games would be a game that flip your controls upside down. Like, I can think of a few where the whole time you're playing, right? Up is up and down is down, and suddenly up is down and down is up. And that is mean. That is very mean. But then you do that, and then what they do next is, okay, so now you know that you can go from up is down and then down is up. Now we're going to mix them. Now there are sections that are colored in blue where up is up and down is down, and things are colored in red now is inversed. So then you have a stage that's both red and blue, and things just, that's you can imitate adaptive difficulty by roping a player, conditioning a player into a line of thought. And then they get so used to it, and then you break the rules deliberately to meta them. The closest thing to adaptive difficulty is PvP. So, the best example of adaptive difficulty is any multiplayer game, any competitive game. That's the example. And obviously, when I was thinking of examples, I was thinking of designed developer examples, where the developer is designing it ahead of time. It doesn't deal with another human element. But that's what makes people think of adaptive difficulty. Yeah. So if you're playing a battle royale game, if you're playing any multiplayer game that involves another human being, that is adaptive difficulty. And I want to be super clear that I don't want to use that term, in my opinion, of adaptive difficulty, because it would imply that I'm talking about competitive games against another human being, where that's not the approach that a single player game designer would want to use. Like, because it would be very unfun. What I mean is, how can you tell a story? It is possible, and I'm looking forward to it if someone does it, where your ultimate loss is how you advance in the story, which has been mirrored. My favorite roguelike genre has done that quite a lot, where your ultimate loss is an advancement in the story. But in this game, imagine the boss is adaptive. How are you ever going to get to the end of the story if the boss is designed to adapt to you until you lose? You're never gonna make it through the story. You could do like a training arc, like I could see a sub story. Okay, let's imagine how can we get it into Yakuza? You play an underling, right? As a sub story, you play someone who's under the tutelage of Kiryu, and no matter what you do, Kiryu is gonna tiger drop your face into the ground eventually, right? But that's how the story continues. Like, so your goal is to not get tiger dropped as hard as possible by Kiryu, and then it advances the story or something. I don't know. Something like that. Like, Kiryu is the end goal, but you can never beat Kiryu. But you can always deal more damage to Kiryu over time, and then you have an alternative goal that because you're training against Kiryu, you ultimately can do other things, which is kind of the boxing trainer, master, sensei kind of relationship, where you go off to practice with your sensei, and then your sensei is unbeatable, but you can always challenge him. He's just gonna always be one up on you at some point. If you kind of hurt him more, he's gonna make it harder and harder. So in actuality, you're getting better, but you never get any progress against your sensei because your sensei is adapting to you. So, like for example, you land 3 hits on Kiryu, you'll always land no more than 3 hits on Kiryu because he will always get better while you're getting better too. And then you take that and then you go and like beat other people up, right? And then you'll know that from beating other people up, those people are chumps now, but you never get any good, like noticeable feedback from Kiryu because he's designed to always beat you with efficiency. And I could think of a way that could work out. For me, I would put like Kiryu at the top, like he's like Komaki now, right? He would turn into Komaki when he's 60, and you play a new age, like a dragon protagonist, and he trains you. And no matter what, he's gonna kick your butt so hard, and you never feel like you ever get any progress on him. But then the game pits you against other targets, and you just realize that Kiryu basically taught you everything you need to know to kick the butt out of everyone else. In this game, though, you actually kick the butt out of the masters. So, all the games up to this point that I played in the Yakuza series, the masters train you, but you kick their butts in the process. And then they use dialogue and stuff to say like, oh, good job, like you didn't really actually beat them. But you don't actualize that because you actually crush them. You crush the masters to get your skills and stuff. In real life, in IRL, it rarely happens. The person who's more skilled and experienced tend to be more skilled and experienced. You can't take it away from them. You can learn as much and extract as much from them. But inevitably, even if you beat them now, they were never in their prime to be fought with in the first place, like in anything, not just physical confrontation. Like the person before you that precedes you is rarely ever surpassed by you because it's an apples and orange comparison. So that's kind of the idea. At least that's the psychology behind it.